Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the Atlantic Council to this expert panel on the FSO Safer titled Time for Action on a Ticking Time Bomb. My name is Yusra Al-Baqir. I'm a foreign affairs journalist, and I will be moderating today's event. I invite you all to use Zoom's Q&A feature to submit your questions, which I will go through after each of our speakers has presented. Before I introduce our impressive panel of experts, I'd like to briefly go over the topic of today's discussion. The FSO Safer is a decaying tanker moored almost 5 miles off the northern coast of Yemen with 1.14 million barrels of oil on board. Its condition continues to deteriorate, and with each day that passes, there is an increasing threat of a catastrophic oil spill with wide-reaching environmental and humanitarian consequences. As a journalist, I can say that there has not been even close to enough media coverage and public discourse around the Safer. And so often, these issues are not raised until the damage has been done. So I'm very happy to be here and hear more from people who've been working across the issue over the last few years. Allow me to introduce them to you all. First, we have Dr. Ian Ralby, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He's a recognized expert in maritime security and international law, working with governments and international organizations around the world to address evolving and emerging threats in the maritime domain. He'll be giving us an overview of where we are now in regards to the Safer, the reality of the threat it poses, and the different pathways to resolution. Next, we have Dr. Chris Reddy. Dr. Reddy is a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and faculty member of their joint program with MIT in oceanography. For the past 25 years, he has studied and responded to numerous international oil spills. Dr. Reddy will be giving us invaluable insight into the ecological and environmental impact we can expect in the case of a Safer oil spill. After him, we will hear from Ambassador Khalid Al-Yemany. Dr. Al-Yemany is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. He previously served as a foreign minister of Yemen from 2018 to 2019 after holding the position of deputy foreign minister from 2016. Before this, he served as Yemen's permanent representative to the UN. Dr. Al-Yemany will be talking us through the humanitarian and socio-economic threat posed by the Safer, not just in Yemen, but along the Red Sea coastline, and discuss what these nations can do to circumvent disaster. Last, but certainly not least, we have Kirsten Fortin-Rose, a non-resident senior fellow and former director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. She's currently the president of Red Six International. Before this, Kirsten was senior director for the Gulf at the National Security Council, leading the development of US policy towards nations of the GCC, Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Today, Kirsten will be walking us through different diplomatic and political pathways to solving the Safer crisis. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing all your perspectives. Dr. Rabi, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Yusra, and thanks to all my fellow panelists. I'm honored to be here with you, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for holding this event. I've been working with the Atlantic Council for the last 5 years now, and about to enter our 6th. And my team and I at IR Consortium have been working on issues related to oil and fuel crimes around the world. In the context of that work, we were actually tipped off in 2018 to the presence of a floating threat in the Red Sea. The FSO Safer at the time was not mentioned almost anywhere in the news. There was no coverage of any kind of looming threat or danger. And so my team and I began internally within our own channels to raise this as a concern that we should potentially address. And in 2019, we began publishing on it, and more than half a dozen publications and reports and more than 100 different media interviews later, we still have not been able to get to the point of resolution. And so as we come to the end of what has been for many of us a long and fairly tragic week, I want to highlight how important it is that we actually be holding this conversation on this topic today. Things this week have been shocking, but they were not unforeseeable. There have been, over the last several years, many different instances of shocking but not unforeseeable events, and the Safer is one of many. The Beirut blast in August of 2020 was shocking, but it was not unforeseeable. I had been part of discussions about that very ammonium nitrate earlier in the summer. We could have done something about it. We didn't. The Mauritius oil spill in August 2020 as well was preventable. There were 2 weeks where action could have been taken. It wasn't. And more than $1 billion worth of harm was done to one of the most pristine marine protected areas in the world. The Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez Canal was foreseeable, but we did not have enough resilience in place to prevent it. And the list goes on. But this week really should be a reminder that if we do not act to prevent preventable disasters, they will and often do actually happen and are as bad as many of us expect them to be. So let me tell you a little bit about the FSO Safer and what we can do at this point to still prevent this from becoming another of those long list of disasters. In 1976, the FSO Japan was built as an ultra-large crude carrier, a ULCC, meaning that it can hold 3 million barrels of oil. It sailed for roughly a decade before, in 1987, being converted into an FSO and renamed the FSO Safer. And since 1988, the FSO Safer has been moored, as Yusra said, about 4.8 nautical miles off the coast of Yemen near Ras Isa. That vessel was one of the principal export points for Marib light crude oil. Marib is 270 miles away from Ras Isa, and the vessel itself is still, to this day, connected to the 272-mile-long Marib-Ras Isa pipeline. That means that not only are we talking about 1.14 million barrels of crude oil on board the vessel, we also are talking about a pipeline that still contains roughly 17,000 barrels between the shore and the ship. Since the outbreak of the war, a lot of things have happened, but it's worth noting that prior to the outbreak of war, this vessel was due to be decommissioned. In 1988, when this was put into place, it was only supposed to last 10 years. It was supposed to be decommissioned before the year 2000. And in 2000, when it hadn't yet been decommissioned, there was a 5-year plan initiated, and then another 5-year plan in 2005, and then another 5-year plan in 2010. And in 2015, construction was underway for a land-based facility in Ras Isa that later that year would complete the lifespan of the FSO Safer. Unfortunately, the war interrupted those plans, and since early in 2015, the Houthis have controlled the area of Ras Isa. But this is in many ways a microcosm of the conflict, because not only is the FSO Safer in Houthi-controlled territory, but its legal ownership, as well as the pipeline to which it's attached and the oil on board, belongs to CPOC, the Safer Exploration, Production, and Operating Company. That is a parastatal company. It is owned by the government of Yemen. And so we have government of Yemen-owned equipment, infrastructure, and oil in Houthi-controlled areas. And that is why this is such a difficult challenge to address. But over the last couple of years, we've seen an evolution of problems that are now making this as critical as it could possibly be. And we do not know how much time we have before we reach a full catastrophe. In July 2017, the inerting system on the ship went dead. That means the air above the 34 oil compartments on the ship no longer was being injected with inert gas in order to prevent the oxidation of the air. That means that since 2017, this has gradually been becoming a bomb. The air is what becomes flammable in contact with crude oil. That's why you don't leave oil-soaked rags in a sealed container in your garage. It is not actually the rags that catch fire. It is the air that catches fire. And so since 2017, we have been gradually coming to a point where even a hammer strike or a match strike could blow up this entire ship. If you don't believe that, do look at what just happened with the Trinity floating production and storage facility off of Nigeria just last month. That is exactly what occurred. And it did blow up and it did spill. Fortunately, however, there were 50,000 barrels of oil on it, not 1.14 million. So to put that in context, the Exxon Valdez spill of 1989, which changed our entire approach to safety measures, making it so that this vessel today could not be built because it is not strong enough to withstand the possible implications of either a rupture of the external hull or a sinking. That spill was 250,000 barrels. This is 1.14 million. And just for other context, the Mauritius spill, the Israeli spill, and the Brazil spill in the last couple of years, all of which have garnered tremendous media attention, are each less than 1% of what is at stake with the Safer. Less than 1%. So we're talking about massive potential in terms of the spill, but that spill could occur via an explosion. It could also occur via fire, because since 2017, the firefighting system on the ship has also been down. And since 2017, the anti-cathodic system, which prevents the rust and deterioration of the ship, has also died. And that corrosion is really critical because for the last 5 years now, that ship has been sitting in some of the most unforgiving maritime conditions on Earth. The hot saline sea of the Red Sea is incredibly unforgiving to unprotected metal, and that ship is rusting. It is a slow burn that could lead to a spill at any time. Thankfully, the hull is quite thick, and thankfully, the team on board have moved some of the external oil towards the central compartments, but we are by no means safe. And we've actually come close to 2 additional disasters. In April 2019, actually on Easter Sunday, the 22nd of April that year, which some of you may remember was also the day of the terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka, the Safer nearly fell apart. And the reason was that the hose piping system that connects, that would have connected the Safer to passing oil tankers for offloading, broke, fell into the sea, and began to fill. And so it began pulling on the ship as an anchor. Thankfully, CPOC has, since 2015, maintained a small skeletal crew on board. Initially, they had more people. It was down to 7 at that point. But those 7 individuals were able to quickly act to cut the hose pipe and make sure that it did not drop on the subsea pipeline and create another type of rupture. But it was a close call. And that close call was even more acute in May 2020 when a pipe burst in the engine room. That burst pipe started spilling water into the engine room, which was filling rapidly. Thankfully, the engineers on board were able to close that pipe, clamp it, and negotiate with the local Houthis in Ras Issa to bring divers in to makeshift affix steel plates to seal up the sea chest, which bring in water for the cooling system. That means the cooling system is done on that ship. It will not be coming back online. So not only is the firefighting system down, but the cooling system is as well. And so that incident in May 2020 brought a couple of new challenges and really accelerated our concern. And it has started to accelerate the concern at the UN Security Council, but action has yet to come. The reason we are so concerned is that, one, if those seals do not hold and they are leaking, they're spreading already, the engine room filling could sink the ship itself. But it could also bring the ship off of its axis enough that the anchor chains that hold the ship in place could break. Now, that could do one of 2 things. The anchor chains breaking could also break the hull of the ship, which would mean it would sink and spill. That's a big problem. But equally problematic is the concern that it could actually break free and become a floating, moving, dead ship with 1.14 million barrels of oil in an area that is known to be mined. So the mining situation is absolutely critical, both for accessing the vessel to offload it and for ensuring that it does not break free. We have seen ships hit by floating mines. We have seen ships float into mines, and we cannot afford that to occur with this particular vessel. So the exacerbation of these concerns in August 2020 also led to a new situation on board in that the Houthis decided at that point to place more close monitoring on the 7 engineers on board, I should say engineers and crew. And so since that time, there have been 5 armed Houthis on board, and that remains the case to this day. So no matter how you look at this issue, we have something that some of us should care about. If your main interest is energy, this is an energy issue. If your main interest is food, this is a food security issue, because the fisheries in the area are worth millions and millions of dollars and are in fact the 2nd largest after oil economic activity of Yemen. And it is a major, major concern that the oil on board will also destroy the desalination plants that are along the coast of Yemen, and I will let others speak more about that later. But if drinking water is your concern, this is a drinking water problem. If coral is your concern, the world's most temperature-resilient coral systems are in the Red Sea, and they will be destroyed by this, and I know Chris Reddy will speak about that more momentarily. If tourism is your concern, beaches covered in oil are not very good for vacations. If naval bases are your interest, the naval bases of China, of the United States, of France, and the prospective one of Russia on the Red Sea coast, as well as those of the Red Sea coastal states, are all in jeopardy. If shipping is your concern, look at how much damage was done by the Ever Given blocking the Suez for just 6 days in March of last year. $400 million an hour is the cost of that incident to the shipping industry, and this could close the Red Sea for months. And so all of these are important issues, but nothing is more important than the fact that at stake are human beings. And so we have to find a way to protect the lives of the millions of people who may die either for lack of drinking water or for lack of access to food supplies through the Port of Hodeidah if this occurs, not to mention all the livelihoods that will be affected for decades. In August 2020, Ira Concilium, my team, through various channels, put forward an approach that we think will work and could work. The oil on board is not so much the concern. The Houthis are most interested in the actual infrastructure. And so they are very keen to maintain the possibility of export through a terminal at that same location. And so getting rid of the Safer has been a non-starter for the Houthis, and they have made it very clear that they do not want to negotiate on those terms. However, there is the possibility of transferring the oil off to a seaworthy vessel, and that seems to be moving forward as a potential solution. We've seen an agreement in principle between the UN and some of the parties in recent months. That agreement in principle is shaky, and it has seen some serious pushback in the last few days. But ultimately, it is the only way forward that will get us to where we can at least safely remove the threat, even if we do not remove the full situation. But in the coming months, I believe the UN will be seeking for donations to buy a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, to transfer the oil. They will still need to work out demining, and they will need to work out securing that operation, because it will likely take a month to unload it. But we do have a path, at least, that we can look to and try to support as the way forward now. Ultimately, the Red Sea is of global interest, and there are many different interests that come into stake, but this is much beyond economics, it's much beyond politics. This is our home. The earth is our home. And this is a massive, massive degree of harm that will be committed against our home if we do not do something about it. We've seen preventable conflicts, preventable situations not be prevented, but the amount of work it will take to prevent the Safer from becoming a catastrophic disaster for us is far less than the amount of effort it will take to remedy that disaster if it does occur. So I thank the opportunity to share that with this panel, and I look forward to the other comments and to the questions after.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabbi, for that comprehensive explanation. Next, please, Dr. Chris Reddy. Love to hear from you.
Well, thank you for having me here and the opportunity to speak about Safer today. You know, in the oil spill community,
sorry, Dr. Reddy, you're
bad
breaking.
Thing from getting worse. So today we're thinking about. Pardon me.
You broke up, so if you just want to start from the beginning, you're okay now. But if you just start.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you again for having me here. In the oil spill community, in terms of response, there's a saying that says you want to make a bad thing from getting worse. So we can think about this ship right now filled with oil as a bad thing, and we want to have this discussion today about how we can make it from stopping it from getting worse. You know, I study oil spills, whether they're what happens in the first couple hours, a couple days, to whether or not some residues of oil will last for decades and decades. And if there's one key takeaway, is that every oil spill is different. There is a certain amount of knowledge. Oh, you gotta be kidding me.
Oh. You're back.
Oh, I'm sorry. There is a certain amount of knowledge from past spills that we can use to bring to the table, which I'm going to talk about today. And there's also been a few studies about in the gray literature and also in the peer review about this issue, and they are a good start. But you know, science is iterative, and it's building upon. So we want to add to this conversation. Often, when folks talk about oil spills, we think about volume, how much oil is going to release. It's easy for us to visualize how much something is there. And that is certainly a parameter when we want to gauge what type of an impact an oil spill is, but also how we respond to it, and what is our planning and what mechanisms we can put in place. I think what's more important to bring to the table today is other aspects of oil spills besides the volume. And I think the highest priority that we want to bring into this conversation is the type of oil. The type of oil is the absolutely critical aspect of understanding the spill, as well as the location. And another factor is not the volume, but the how fast it will be released. So we want to think about the type of oil, where is this oil possibly going to be released, the volume, as well as how fast that volume will be released, and how might it be released. You know, I'm not going to talk as much about location and volume, but I will say that five nautical miles offshore is a buffer. You know, we can think about it from a good news, bad news. It is a 5-mile buffer that provides some positives, but also it's so close that it has positives in the fact that you can get nearby. So it's not 20 miles offshore where it's further away from harming folks, but also your assets to get in theater and to access it are limited. So there's a trade-off between how close you are to an area of activity in terms of the closer it is to land, the more likely there are impacts, but also it's easier to access in terms of operations. Just talking about volume, I think we have to remember, we don't know, there are 34 tanks, and each one of those tanks, the oil is distributed. It is difficult for us to right now think about where all that oil is, but I'm willing to wager that whatever oil is being predicted is on there, some fraction of it has evaporated out of the ship. So there is predictably less on there than what we know. And again, volume released is whether or not, if there is an unfortunate event, does it all get released in 1 day, 10 days? Does it get released in 10 days and then it stops and then happens again in 6 months? So my key point here is that we keep talking about this release as something happening in a couple of days. I would worry just as much as a release of a significant volume of oil released over 30 days. So much less of a punch, but a much more sustained challenge. So we want to think about, this is a different type of oil, the type of oil and the rate of release. Often when we think about crude oils, we envision it to be this black, sticky crude. That's not the case here. This product, this Marib light crude, is a crude oil. That is, it's been taken out of the ground and not yet refined. Oh my God, I can't believe this is doing this.
We can hear you okay.
Yeah, it's an unrefined oil. And I want to be careful here about what I'm saying here. But this oil, we want to envision this in terms of a response and how this might play out. This is a product that is more similar to diesel fuel and kerosene. It has the attributes and the behavior of it. And with that, gives a different perspective on the potential impacts, in terms of injury in the short term and the long term, what type of assets you can use to recover and contain the spilled oil, what type of mechanisms you could use as countermeasures, and also how long it may last into the environment. So in this case, we want to envision this not as a black, sticky crude oil, but a very, very light, not particularly viscous. It still floats, but it can mix into the water as well. So we want to frame this as a very light material. But luckily, there's been a very, very good PhD thesis done by a Sudanese PhD thesis in chemistry in 2017 that did a very sound workup and analysis of that oil on there. And when we know what type of oil is on there, we can use those parameters and those behaviors to understand what might the outcome be. So we have some excellent data about what was put on the ship initially. And there's also a very sound ExxonMobil technical sheet. So we have very good resources about what is on the ship if it is a Marib light. Again, this is NARDOC. Because it's so much more like a liquid, it does handcuff the response mechanisms. In situ burning, you can't do it as well. You'll need no need for chemical dispersants. Some booms and sorbents work, but it's tricky to corral such a light product. The ways in which we are going to fight back on this oil is in communication and response, in terms of trying to get folks out of harm's way and keeping folks safe, trying to close down water intakes as well. So getting on the front lines may not necessarily be fighting the oil, but being nimble to lessen the damages. This oil is not going to bioaccumulate for a very long time. It will last very short once it's into the environment. But that shortness is a very acute blow. There will be, in the right circumstances, there will be a significant amount of oil into the water column, which will expose fish and lead to injury. But it will be a short-term blow. When this type of oil gets released into the environment, it will evaporate significantly. Arguably, 50% of the oil that gets evaporated that gets released will evaporate. Now that's good news in terms of out of sight and dilution in the long term, but in the short term, it increases a significant amount of inhalation. So we have, again, these trade-offs that the oil will be long gone very quickly in a couple of days. But in that short period, depending on which way the winds are blowing and the currents are, you have significant amount of exposure to humans. This will be acute effects. Of course, the timing is depending which way the winds are blowing, which way the currents are blowing. It could be positive in terms of blowing offshore. Very windy gives us excellent transport away from what's getting evaporated. These are going to be chaotic times. And when we think about the injury, there will be injury depending on how long the contact is and the fraction of oil that is in place. This oil is changing constantly. There is no set oil. The oil that's on the ship, probably a little bit's evaporated. Once it's evaporated, it's a different beast. Once it's on the water, it's getting evaporated. We're constantly changing. Nature is constantly changing the behavior of this oil, which adds a significant amount of complexity. In terms of recovery to the environment, it's mixed. And as a general rule, the recovery to different species in an ecosystem is related to its growth rate. So if you have a fast-growing fish, it should recover. It's difficult to predict, but years, or even 1 or 2 years. But slow-growing corals and valuable species, they do not respond and recover very quickly. So an unfortunate exposure to corals will be a long-lasting injury. Again, we are at the mercy of the winds and currents. They're both positive and negative. We can get the wind blowing away, being diluted, currents moving away from humans. It will be a victory. I want to talk more about being volume released. And I said earlier, I don't think it will be very difficult to release all that oil in the time periods of days. I think it's going to be will be more likely to be dragged out for a longer period. Even if there's an explosion, I envision it to be very difficult to release all that oil so quickly. Some tanks might be never released, or maybe the ship sinks and some of the tanks stay intact, but then eventually it may be released. So we have to think about this as possibly a very fast release. It could be a slower release over months, or even worse, I think, in some respects, an intermittent, where you could have a significant amount of release. There's a lot of volume that can create injury that could be difficult to predict, and that this is a much longer, unstable, unpredicted potential event. So let me give you some of my recommendations. I think the most pressing in terms of, for me, to think about this spill is to find out what is on the ship in terms of how much of the volume is still there, and also getting an understanding of the chemistry. What is the composition of that oil? Is it very still similar to what was pumped on? Has a lot of it evaporated away? The good thing is, if a lot of it has evaporated, it will leave a signature that will allow us to give a better understanding of how we plan and respond. Essentially, we have to know our enemy. And so we need the intelligence to have an understanding of what is on that ship. And there's a distinct possibility that some tanks may have a different composition, that some of them evaporated away and other tanks don't. So we were dealing with a heterogeneous problem as well. With this knowledge, you can have more well-informed modeling and current modeling experiments, and to understand and gauge where we need to protect, where do we need to set up the best communication routes so that we can lessen the damages. Whatever the case may be, this is going to be a very fast and abrupt releases. This oil will move very quickly. It will evaporate very quickly. We want to get in front of this as best as possible and set up monitoring networks, either from satellites, which have some utility, overflights, even on water, folks driving on boats, or even the personnel on the ship that can identify that there's a release happening. So it could be both by their nose or visually, or even putting a series of sensor packages that are essentially instruments that can smell for the oil. I think now with the technology that's evolved in the last 10 years, we're well positioned to start using technology that maybe have a lower profile and be as effective. And that is aerial reconnaissance with drones that we can be constantly surveying for any releases, and also to have an understanding about how dynamic and changes are when there is a release. So in the air, we can be monitoring. We can have fixed buoys in places where we can set up fixed stations to also get insight about where, if there's a release. We also can put in underwater vehicles. Think about them as robots that can also monitor, keep an eye on where things are going, so we have the most well-informed information to make the best decisions. This technology is evolving very quickly. We're well positioned to be able to have assets in the air with no humans involved, and they can be operated far ashore. Whatever the case may be, we want to have this technology and the information that we have centralized in rapid communication, and have a unified command system put in place so that we can have a collective decision-making team, a way in which we communicate what's going on and what are the outcomes. It's incredibly important that all this information gets filtered into one area. It will have to be extremely fluid because this is an oil that the type of oil, this light crude oil, will spread very quickly. It is going to evaporate very quickly. I'm not a humanist. I'm a chemist, but I've spent enough time on the ground and with people after oil spills that this is very much an oil spill that affects people. We can talk about corals. We can talk about our favorite species, but at the end of the day, oil spills affect humans, not only in terms of their lifestyle, but also their mental health. I've seen countless folks that when you're already in a challenging position, it's even worse when you have the uncertainty of an oil spill that you can see and smell, and you can't do anything about it. And I want to be very careful, and I want to be delicate here, that historically, predictions about an oil spill do not play out to the extent that are predicted. I'm not necessarily sure that this may be the case here. This is a diesel fuel, a product that is more like diesel fuel, to me, is the type of oil that I worry about the most. But nevertheless, we also have to be mindful of the terms that we're using to communicate in terms of making action and to try to draw attention, also can affect the people that are living there now. We want to be mindful of the fact that the words that we're using to draw attention to this problem, which is necessary, are the types of words that also can affect those people. And it can hurt their minds and their personalities and their whole being. They're just how difficult it may be. So there's a balance in terms of communicating what the problem could be, but also being mindful that that affects the people that are living there. So be happy to follow up, and I appreciate all the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. I really appreciated how you looked at different ways that this could play out and different ways it would impact marine life. Thank you so much. Yep. Next, we have Dr. Al-Yemany. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Yusra. And let me just start by saying that today, as we have this very important meeting, and I'm thankful to the Atlantic Council, Middle East and Atlantic Council, Global Energy for organizing this timely discussion on this topic, very important topic for the region, not only for Yemen, for the region, for the world. And just listening to Dr. Chris, you realize that this is huge. This is something that can go as far as to the north, as far as Egypt, and can go down to the Gulf of Aden. That this can be very volatile and dangerous. Today, the Security Council will adopt a new resolution on Yemen, renewing the mandate of the panel of experts on Yemen. It's a valuable instrument of international law to investigate the targeted arms embargo established in UN Security Council Resolution 2216 against the Houthi rebel group. And also, it's very important to know that this resolution is under Chapter 7 of the Charter, and it might include also enlisting the Houthis as a movement, as a group, as a terrorist group in the United UN system. Also, in 2 weeks, we have another very important event in the UN. We have the pledging conference on Yemen. Yemen is still, as you know, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And last year, it was around 50% of the pledging covered by contribution from member states. And we hope that this time, international community will be generous with Yemen to cover more of the OCHA and UN partners' needs to work to help Yemenis navigate this war and the humanitarian crisis. As you know, for the Houthis, the FSO Safer was used during the last year as a protective shield against any coalition attempts to advance over ports of Hodeidah from the sea. They were thinking that they will blow it and they will use it as instrument of war to make it difficult for anyone to advance over Hodeidah. But this is the mood of a guerrilla, of a rebel movement that will never recognize the humanitarian impact, will never recognize the environmental impact, will never recognize that this is very international navigational routes for international trade. And that's why we think that it's very important what we have achieved so far with the efforts of David Grassley now. During discussion with the UN and in the early 2019, and I was the foreign minister of Yemen, the government of Yemen encouraged the UN to take the leading role in addressing FSO Safer because we thought that any revenues can come. There we are talking roughly about 80 million. And I don't know how much of it is already evaporated, or are we having 1.14 million in that storage, floating storage. But we are talking about roughly 80 million, and we were talking about we can use this amount of money to support the payment of public salaries or to support the ailing health system in Yemen. And actually, during the time of Liz Grande as RC in Yemen, she was the resident coordinator for the United Nations in Yemen, and she failed to do anything with the Houthis. We try, and again, the answer was no, until we managed to send the team of inspection, and we started to build up this sort of international engagement. As you know, and the Professor Chris and Dr. Ian mentioned that a massive spill would be disaster. It will close the 3 seaports of Yemen. And also, if it goes down, it will close Al-Khoukha and Al-Makha. And also, we'll close it for some time, because it will disrupt all the humanitarian relief operations and food supply, of which half of the country's population depend. This could also disrupt desalination plants, and Dr. Ian mentioned that Saudi Arabia depends on the west coast on few desalination units that supply the western Saudi Arabia. And also the spill would also shut down the fishing industry. That's millions around the sea coast. Depends in Eritrea, and Yemen, Sudan, even Djibouti, even as far as Egypt, because we know that in the past, Egypt fishermen were found fishing in our area. Because if you see, the southern part of the Red Sea is divided into 2. The eastern part is the navigational lane, and the western part is the coral reef. It's very rich, and it's a fishery ground. That's why Yemeni fishermen, they will cross Yemen and they will go to the western side of the Red Sea for their daily activities. So that's why I think Eritrea, Sudan, all the countries, Djibouti, all the countries of the Red Sea should have their voice on this issue, and they should not be kept silent, and they should express their concerns. And this is something that I will keep saying, and I will keep warning, that it's not an issue of Yemenis, that they are in the middle of the war and kidnapped by the Houthi movement and pushing Yemen to the brink of total chaos. It's a concern of the international community. We are talking about 60% of all the European oil and gas needs going through that passage. 25% of the American imports of the Gulf oil is also going through the passage, and around, according to international trade data, we are talking about $2.5 trillion of goods and merchandise, 13% of the total global trade going through the Red Sea. So it's very important, not only for Yemenis, for all of us. The food going to Europe is depending on the Red Sea and that passage. So the Houthis rejected, as I mentioned, all the proposals. We have now David Grassley working on the memorandum of understanding. We hope he will manage to convince them. He presented already the memo to them in Sana'a, and they rejected the first draft, and they asked, they wanted to see the Netherlands signing the memo, and we hope that we will see the end of this dark tunnel, and we look at it from an environmental issue, and that's why we are trying to persuade the Houthis this is an issue that concerns you and all Yemenis and all the people around this area and the international trade, and it should not be used as a tool of war. So I don't want to go into the scientific part of it, because Dr. Chris mentioned a lot, and we know that it's hot area, and evaporation is speedy, and also the currents are in that area can go south and north depending on the seasons, and we call upon the Houthis, and we use this platform to call upon the Security Council to act. It's now the time to act. It's time for action, and we need to finish this issue before it's getting serious and threaten the life and of millions in Yemen and the southern Red Sea, and also the international trade. Thank you. I will leave it here, and I will be ready to address any questions, Yusra, through you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Yemany, much appreciated. That was very important political and social context. Kirsten, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks so much. My role here is to kind of talk a little bit about what policymakers are considering. And the question for policymakers in each stakeholder country is, what are our options? You know, the question of Yemen's future, and certainly the question of the tanker, can't be answered in a political vacuum. There's much to consider. And I'll offer some options for the purposes of discussion that will inevitably take place in all of our offices after we all log off of here. And these are intended to be perhaps a little bit, to spark some debate. The first option I'll throw out is talking to Iran. But I'm not suggesting that we complicate talks in Vienna with this issue. This conversation should be separate. Iranian leverage may be the only leverage that is relevant anymore in this conversation. Even if they do not dictate Houthi actions as they claim, it is confirmed and documented by the UN that they supply the Houthis with arms and components they need to fight the Saudi-led coalition and to launch missiles and drones into Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But in order to move Iran on this issue, the international community would need to coalesce around the position that the Houthi position on the tanker is essentially environmental hostage taking. Left unaddressed, once a leak begins, the act of refusing to allow the international community to address the threat of a catastrophic oil spill will constitute environmental terrorism by the UN's definition of terrorism. It would be the act of intentionally targeting non-military lives and locations for the purposes of political leverage. So the issue could be a rare opportunity for the international community to invite Iranian action in Yemen that would be praised. Nobody wants to be called an environmental terrorist on the international stage. And frankly, this conversation would not be much of a cost to Iran. They would be asked to make it clear to the Houthis that the flow of their fight-sustaining weaponry will end if they do not allow the tanker to be safely offloaded and then disposed of. A second option I'll throw out, always at the forefront of American thought, is sanctions. In this case, new sanctions actively enforced on those responsible within the Houthi apparatus for the decision to prevent the international community from addressing the tanker problem. And as Biden quietly debates the merits of designating the Houthis within the ranks of the Democratic Party, the Safer tanker spill risk to the marine environment should be discussed, because environmental issues are of utmost importance to many of those in his party who otherwise oppose designation. It should be noted that even this internal US political party discussion won't occur in a vacuum. I'll give you one example to illustrate this point and why it's so complicated. The main reason the Biden administration is uncomfortable with redesignating the Houthis is that because, as Khalid mentioned, designation makes it legally difficult for aid organizations to distribute humanitarian assistance to Yemenis who need it. The majority of the wheat that comes into Hodeidah right now is from Ukraine. So the ability to distribute food assistance is not solely impacted by decisions about the Houthis or about Yemen, but also by geopolitical events elsewhere and the US government's decisions about how to deal with those events. A third option could be removing the financial promise of revenues from the oil sale from the political equation. The oil on board is estimated to be worth about 60 million. I mean, I'd leave it to Ian or Chris to correct that, but that's the last estimate I've read. So could the sale of oil offloaded from the tanker be placed in an escrow to fund the budget passed by the next legitimately elected Yemeni government and legislature? Or could a consortium of companies be offered the oil to sell for their own profit in exchange for fully attending to the tanker, from offloading to the environmental caretaking to disposal of the ship carcass, etc.? The cost of attending to the vessel would certainly be lower than the estimated $20 billion cost of recovering from the predicted spill. Yemen's GDP from the last reported was about a little less than 22 billion. So 2 billion more than the cost of recovering from the spill. Not an option. One thing is certain. We need a new UN resolution, as Khalid attested to, one that incorporates this issue into its provisions. 2216 is outdated, it's unrealistic, it's unimplementable. It's not that we should give up what it says, it's that it needs to be updated and it needs to be added to. It is hindering the ability of Hans Grunberg and his country envoy counterparts to make progress. If necessary, a new resolution to deal solely with the tanker is not a bad idea. Russia and China have proven loath to support new resolution concepts that limit the ability of external parties to arm the Houthis. But Russia's only gain from the Safer issue is that the oil stays off the market, making theirs ever so slightly more valuable. Russia could use some international goodwill right now and could no doubt come up with clever ways to leverage their willingness to support action on the tanker file or a new resolution. Certainly, the Saudis and the Emiratis should and could encourage Russian support for this. Just this week, the Emirati and Russian foreign ministers met and put out a statement that their countries seek closer cooperation. This is a tough time for a country to say that it seeks to work more closely with Russia, not without risk for the UAE. The least Russia could do is support the UAE, which takes the presidency of the UN Security Council next week in an effort to vote in new resolutions on Yemen. The Houthis could also use some goodwill right now. They are aware that the ship cannot be salvaged. They are aware that they do not have the resources or capabilities to deal with it themselves. But while they are kidnapping American embassy former staffers and attacking Gulf neighbors and generally destroying any goodwill they've had with the international community and any benefit of the doubt they've been given, it would be a great opportunity for them to make themselves champions of environmentalism and likely win some of that goodwill back. The main takeaway here is that every stakeholder has interest in resolving this tanker issue, including the Houthis, who cannot afford the international condemnation that would be piled upon them if a spill or an explosion occurs. We can expect some activity on the Yemen file at the UN very soon because of the UAE's role at the helm of the Security Council starting in March. So now is the time, I would argue, to try to shape what that activity should look like and what it should focus on. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's good to know that there are options. Let's put it that way. Great. So we have not had questions. Please feel free to submit them. We still have a little bit of time, but I have a few. So I will go through them now with each of the panelists. Dr. Ralby, I mean, there have been several occasions over the last few years where the UN has come close or seemed to have come close to getting close to the Safer and inspecting the vessel as a very first step. How confident are you that this effort to inspect the vessel and begin the process of transporting oil could actually go through?
I'd be lying if I said I was in any way close to confident. The Houthis have shown a remarkable ability to string the UN along and then renege. That's not a judgment call. That's just the course of conduct. And it's I think, as Kristen said, an opportunity where Iran could play a really helpful role in catalyzing actually some commitment to an agreement that ultimately will benefit everyone. I mean, no one wins if this spills. And that, I don't think, has been a message that the Houthis have understood throughout. They have been very negative towards some of the comments, saying that people care more about shrimp than they do the people of Yemen. They have been very hostile towards the notion that this is actually in any way a big deal. And they seem to think that they'll be fine and that an oil spill will be cleaned up and everything will be okay. They also lived for years under the very false understanding that the vessel was salvageable at this point in terms of not salvage as a maritime concept, but salvageable in terms of being able to be reworked and operated. I think that it's worth noting, as Kristen said, that the cost of the spill is depending on the estimates, as much or more than the GDP of Yemen in the first year. And that does not account for the long-term harm that Chris noted about the coral systems and potentially the economic plans of other states around the region. And it isn't just neighboring Saudi Arabia, it is the entire Red Sea basin. So I think the Houthis are starting to understand that this will ultimately hurt them, but it hasn't gotten them to the point of actually being willing to really move forward. They could do with some goodwill. Maybe that will be a motivator, but I think they will need a bit more of a push than that. And the cost and price of the oil on board is a bit of a red herring. I mean, we are talking about a small amount of money in the big scheme of things in comparison to the value of having an export facility. And I think that the assault on Marib, way away from the Safer, was very closely tied to how the Houthis were negotiating their position vis-a-vis the Safer. Since they've been pushed back a bit by the Giants Brigade, their interests are shifting. And so I think we have to continue to recognize that they may not be a good faith actor. We have to be prepared for last minute reneging, as has been the case in almost every other expenditure of assets in furtherance of an inspection. And we have to be willing to press forward in some other way. And that's where the UN Security Council is critical. It has never used Chapter 7 authority to authorize a limited military action for an environmental cause. But this is not an environmental cause, as we've all said. It is, but it is also very much a humanitarian one. And we cannot afford another humanitarian disaster. The Houthis will be very tough to negotiate with on the security of the operation and the demining operation, both of which need to be conducted by a credible military party or some kind of security force. That's going to be a tough bump in the path towards getting them to fully be on board with whatever agreement is reached. So the agreement in principle that we have is good news because it is the right approach. The oil has to come off the ship. They've finally gotten there. But it hasn't gotten us to the point yet where we have enough confidence that this is actually going to happen and we are going to get to resolution before it is too late. And I think that, to Chris's point, we have only been able to access information through people who have been operating on board clandestinely over the years. I mean, that's the extent of the interaction. We have not actually been able to inspect any of what's on board. We know that certain amounts of material have evaporated, roughly 10,000 barrels, but we don't know what we're actually dealing with. So there are a lot of unknowns and we have a long road ahead, but we have to pursue that road and we have to find ways around the roadblocks as they come up.
Thank you. And just on a technical front, I know that IR Consilium got access to really shocking photos from the Safer, and was this over a year ago now?
This is, believe it or not, 3 years ago now. Yeah,
3 years ago.
Over time, but yeah.
So what do we know about the state of corrosion more broadly of the vessel, and is this being accelerated by environmental factors?
Absolutely. The corrosion is pretty extreme. Most of the internal working systems of the ship are down. They will not ever come back online. They would have to be fully replaced. And so that messaging did not make its way fully to the Houthis because they were getting bad advice from someone. But the fact of the matter is the ship is in very bad shape. The hull is thick, so I don't want to overplay that it could pop today. But it could. But we are looking at a situation where the internal workings make it so that the ship is dead. Oil has to come off. It has to be used. External pumping systems have to be used because there is no internal pumping systems left operational. And as I mentioned, it will take about a month to extract it because the vessel will need to go very slowly around the vessel, removing oil such as to not throw the ship off its axis and imbalance the vessel through taking out all the oil in one compartment and not having a ballast system to remedy the kilter of the ship. So that is another complication, and that's why securing it is so critical because it's not a one-day matter. It is about a month operation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. I mean, given the political situation, the risk of explosion isn't that far-fetched. And so I wanted to know from you, I mean, you mentioned different ways that oil release could impact the effect of the spill, but what would happen in the case of an explosion?
Well, I mean, presumably some fraction of that oil will be lost, from the explosion. And then some fraction will be released into the environment immediately. I think the bigger concern is that now you have both a fire and an oil release. And so you increase the complexity and the chaotic nature of that. We've seen this recently with a ship's fire off the coast of Sri Lanka. You have a fire and you're also releasing pollutants, and it's an unfortunate synergy. So I think we want to think about the chaos that would be created when you have an explosion and a potential release. And then again, you now, that explosion is going to affect the integrity of the ship. And again, you're adding more uncertainty to an uncertain situation. And we want to be moving towards certainty so that we can make this bad thing from getting worse.
Thank you. And I also, I mean, when one thinks of the Exxon Valdez spill, you think of blackened beaches and sort of wildlife and all this, what you were talking about in terms of that dense crude oil. Yeah. This seems to be more insidious. And can you just go over again in what way?
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is an oil that will float, but is also that, that if you added a little wind and the current's right, you can mix it into the water. So, we often think about oil and water separating. That's not the case with this type of product. It can mix and be moved below the surface. And that becomes an extreme challenge in terms of trying to respond to it, trying to clean to it and contain it. But also even more unfortunate, it increases the range in which these unfortunate pollutants can interact. Often, in other oil spills with oil floats, species that live far below are relatively safe. But I've worked on other spills with product like this. And you can have a significant amount of damages in species that live below the surface. And that is where the challenge is that the personality of this oil is much distinct. It's not going to float. A lot of it will move into the water. Now that helps in the long term because dilution is your friend eventually. But the short-term impacts of this, this curtain of very high amounts of pollutants could be dramatic. Of course, we're at the mercy of what we don't know about the winds and the currents. The uncertainty is where we're living with. And we have to be mindful of the fact that it may be useful, it may be positive and negative and be ever changing. And so having a very good understanding of the meteorology and the oceanography of the area so that you can be as nimble to respond to and communicate to folks about when there's going to be onshore large amounts of inhalable chemicals is going to be crucial.
Thank you, Dr. Eddy. It's terrifying to hear about it in those terms.
Yeah.
Dr. Al-Yemany, there is a question from the audience that I think that you would be best posed to answer, and that is about, what more can be said about the factors that are driving the Houthi approach to the Safer to date?
As Ian just mentioned, we are talking about a movement that is unpredictable. Sometimes you see them approaching international dialogue. Sometimes they decide not to talk peace at all. They think that they still can win this war because Iran is using them as a tool in their negotiation with the Western countries. They don't want them to stop warring in Yemen because the war for Iran is very, very cheap in Yemen. It's only the pieces of drones and missiles and cruises, and they do the rest. Officers of the Hezbollah and the Al-Quds brigade, they are working on the ground in preparing and launching all these drones and missiles to against Yemenis all over the country or against Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And you see what they are doing in the Red Sea by using these SPD launches with explosives. And they try a lot of them against the Saudi seaports in Jazan, and they will continue doing that. And they use the Safer FSO as, instrument of war. And they will continue threatening the international community and putting more pressure on the international community. I hope that they will sign this memorandum of understanding and they will let go this part because there is a lot of concerns and on it from the humanitarian part, from the environmental part, and the life of a lot of people depends on the Center of Red Sea fisheries, all sorts of things. I hope that they know that this is not a political issue, merely a political issue. It's a humanitarian and environmental, and their contribution will send a good signal to the international community that they are willing to talk, willing to engage, and willing to be positive. We hope to see them on the positive side of the equation, and because this will help us addressing the crisis in Yemen and arrive to a settlement of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Yemany. Kirsten, I mean, you went through very, it was very interesting to hear you talk through the different options, and especially around the UN Security Council and the feasibility of it all. And I wanted to ask you what your read was, with everything going on in the interest from DC in resolving the issue.
There's quite a bit of interest. This is one of the Biden administration's sort of token issues on the Middle East. They came in with a pledge to resolve the Yemen war. And Tim Linderking, our envoy, our presidential envoy for Yemen, leaves this weekend to go out for another 12 days to work on this. They're working on a viable commercial option right now that's in play to offload the oil to a different tanker, but it will mean that the Houthis have to cooperate. So the one thing that this administration didn't count on was that by removing the designation from the Houthis, they assumed there would be more receptivity to negotiation on the part of the Houthis. And they haven't seen that. That's nobody's fault. That's a Houthi decision. Well, it's the Houthis' fault, I guess. But certainly the administration stays very, very committed to arriving at some sort of solution, not just for this issue, but for Yemen writ large. This is sort of part of that package for the administration. I haven't seen specific attention to the tanker issue. Frankly, I haven't seen as much attention as I would have expected, since it is such an environmental risk issue for this administration. But I think that's because they're seeking a holistic solution for Yemen politically first, and hoping that in that vein, then there would become more receptivity to Safer tanker solutions by groups that came into power, that were legitimately elected. If they could get there, if they could get to a political solution, they could then deal with the parties that would be decision makers. Until you have decision makers decided, you really can't get anyone, you don't know who's responsible for giving approvals for access to the tanker itself. It becomes a military issue, and they're trying to avoid getting involved in this as a military issue.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience that I think
I have something to add, if I may.
Yeah, sure. I'll just present to Kirsten this one question, and then I'll do closing remarks for everyone. Thanks, Dr. Al-Yemany. Kirsten, the question is, what pathway is there for consensus in the council, given probably opposition from key members? And that's obviously to you to answer if you think there will be opposition. And what does a draft look like?
I think I covered some of the points about opposition in my comments, so I won't repeat them. But the issue we have is that often we've seen that Russia and China have proposed resolutions that they believe would limit their ability to make sales to Iran. And they also enjoy the leverage that they experience with Saudi and Emirati needs, and then their relationship with Iran on the other side. So they really haven't seen any vested interest on their part in being helpful on this file, because they don't really gain anything from being helpful, and they may lose something, is how they interpret it. They also, of course, want to keep the US mired in other foreign policy issues, and to keep any administration here from finding foreign policy success. That's one of their foreign policy goals, is to make sure that the US looks like a non-preferable partner to other countries around the world. So they have a lot to gain from the fact that this stays a thorn in the side of US foreign policy, and a difficulty for Western countries, a difficulty for countries that prioritize humanitarian or environmental issues. So there's quite a bit that they pull on board from simply being non-active on this file. So it would mean working with them to incentivize their involvement in this. In terms of Russia, I mentioned some of the things that I think could benefit them from being involved. In terms of getting Iran to then give that permission, it comes down to whether or not they think international goodwill is worth enough to them, whether they think they're buried enough in international condemnation, and whether or not they worry that condemnation will result in impacts for them that matter at home. And I don't think we're at that point yet. Even sanctions, public opinion, they just don't weigh heavily enough on the leadership in most of these countries to incentivize them to make changes. So we'd have to see if some of the things going on around the world elsewhere, if the Vienna talks, or if the issue in Ukraine would move any of these bigger players to decide that this issue is something that they could gain from by looking like the good guys.
Thank you, Kirsten. That was really good. So we are way over time. Well, not way over time, I'd say 11 minutes over time. So we've done quite well. But I just wanted to give space to Dr. Al-Yemany, Dr. Rabi. I know you both want to add something. And then, of course, Dr. Reddy and Kirsten, if you have something to add as well, that would be great. And then we will close off this event. So Dr. Al-Yemany, please go ahead.
Thank you, Siraj. Just I want to say one of these recommendations that we can also put down is to encourage countries of the Red Sea Basin to come out with an announcement and encouraging cooperation between the UN. It's on not only the countries in the Red Sea area, but also international partners dealing with this area and having to go on a daily basis through the Red Sea to act and move and encourage the UN Security Council to do more and write and announce their position to see a swift end to this issue. And also, I'm hesitant to see Iran reacting positively on the FSO Safer, because I know how they try to push the international community to the brink and trying to push and exploit this. Just listening to the call yesterday between President Raisi and Putin and exploiting a humanitarian disaster in Ukraine by saying that they are expressing their solidarity against the United States and all this stuff. It shows that the Iranian regime is not willing to talk peace, is not willing to cooperate, is not willing to engage with the international community. I hope that I'm wrong, but this is my impression. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Yemany. Dr. Rabi?
Thanks very much. I'll actually just start with the Iranian point and say that one glimmer of potential hope is that despite all the other geopolitics and perhaps motivations around it, Iran has been extremely careful about not causing an oil spill inside of the near region. And that is something that is actually kind of an anomaly given how many attacks they've perpetrated against tankers. They've done so in a way that may have taken human life, but they have tried not to spill oil. And so there is some optimism that this issue is a point of pressure for them. But I want to answer quickly the question about the depth. It is 122 feet, or roughly 37.25 meters above the surface of, or above the floor of the Red Sea. I'll just close by saying maritime issues are very esoteric, and they are often overlooked and not understood. We don't get how much our life on land relates to what is happening on the water. We don't understand the reality that 90+% of world trade actually does occur by sea. And it's only when we have incidents like the Ever Given that we feel that even for a moment. But the magnitude of this problem is absolutely critical for people to understand and recognize. And when key states around the Red Sea do not even have this as a talking point, do not have this on their consciousness, it means that we have not done enough to communicate the severity of this potential problem, or this problem. It's not a potential problem. If nothing is done, this will be catastrophic. And so we have to recognize that. But I want to end by saying time is of the essence. The Red Sea currents shift direction in May. And right now they are heading in a direction that makes it possible to potentially mitigate the spill, and also it makes it easier to conduct the ship-to-ship transfer. If we don't make this happen by May, we may have another season to wait before conditions are apt to be able to do something safely and realistically, and that makes it all the more challenging to just wait it out and hope for the best. I mean, hope cannot be our strategy on this. We actually have to act. So I appreciate the opportunity to bring these points forward today, and to try to, despite everything else that is going on, still maintain sight of the fact that there are pressing issues all around the world and that we have to do things. Otherwise, it is all to our detriment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Albi. Thank you, Ian. Kirsten, Chris, do you guys have anything to add before we close off?
I just thank the audience for their attention to this issue, because it's certainly one we need to get on top of really quickly.
I would just add to underscore that this is a crude oil that is different than what most mindset is. That's critical to understand and get more knowledge about our enemy, or this beast that we will have to fight, and to expand our understanding of the scenarios that may play out, and that an explosion and a massive release of all the oil in one day is definitely harmful, but that some of the scenarios in which you have delayed or intermittent releases may be as harmful. So expanding the scenarios is necessary. So thinking about this oil's behavior, its personality, and also the potential scenarios. One tank getting released every month. So we have to think about and how that plays out.
Thank you, Chris. So I will start closing off the event. Thank you everyone for joining and for staying. This will be online, so please share it widely. There's a lot of great information in this, and it's all very accessible. If I can understand it, I think anyone can. So thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it, and see you next time.